Well, welcome. I see that according to the computer, there's 60 or 70 people online, so I can't see you, but I trust you're there, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this shift panel on the effects of nature contact on the mental health of children, teens, and early adults. My name is David Berrigan, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm a program officer with the U.S. National Cancer Institute. I have a strong interest in how the built, natural, social, and equity environments influence health behaviors and health across the entire life course. We're at a critical time in the development of the evidence base concerning how nature contact can benefit the mental health of young people. The COVID pandemic, issues related to structural racism, and worldwide events concerning nature and climate change are creating the situation that makes this such a critical time. It's also profoundly important to think about mental health in young people, because in the US alone, an estimated 16% of kids 6 to 17, some 8 million kids, have been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But about half of these kids do not receive the help they need, and many of the existing therapies have mixed effectiveness or rely on drug treatment. Our panel addresses these challenges facing young people today in relation to nature and mental health, successes and new directions in developing programs and policies aimed at facilitating nature contact and its benefits for young people, ideas for enhancing such programs and policies to address under-resourced communities and at-risk populations, and research gaps in understanding the influence of nature contact on mental and physical health. As you can see from the schedule, this whole session is divided into 3 parts. This panel, a short 10-minute break, then 2 World Cafe breakouts, round 1 and 2. The cafes will be a chance to join one of the panelists and discuss the questions that they bring up and share your experiences, your knowledge, your insight, and your questions. There'll be another brief transition, and then we all join back together in a session to revisit the World Cafe conversations and pose questions for the panelists. So I'm delighted to introduce this highly accomplished and distinguished group of researchers and SHIFT awardees. I'm just going to say their names and affiliations. Then each panelist will spend a couple minutes talking about their personal background, history, and where they're coming from, followed by the main part of the panel where we address some of the questions that they think are critical to bring up here. So the panelists are Dr. Donald Rakow, Associate Professor from Cornell College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, Dr. Luis Chawla, Professor Emeritus in the Program in Environmental Design at the University of Colorado Boulder, Dr. Christina Kenga, Assistant Professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and Nadav Sprague, founder of Gateways to the Great Outdoors and future doctor. He's in a PhD program, and we're cautiously optimistic that he'll graduate in 4 or 5 years. So now I want to turn it over to the panelists to do some, to introduce themselves in a little more detail. I believe Don is having some technical difficulties, so we'll start with Nadav, followed by Christine, and then Luis.
Okay, hello, my name's Nadav Sprague, and as David Berrigan nicely introduced me, I am a PhD student in epidemiology at Columbia University. Additionally, I am the founder of Gateway to the Great Outdoors, which is a nonprofit headquartered in St. Louis and Chicago. And our mission is to provide equitable access to environmental education and outdoor and health education. We do so by partnering with St. Louis and Chicago public schools that are 90% or more on the free and reduced lunch program. And we offer them weekly STEAM-based environmental education lessons and then monthly nature-based outings. A lot of the research that I do has to do with how green space and nature contact influences the health and well-being of youth, specifically low-income, non-white urban youth, such as the population that GGO serves.
Thanks, Nadav. Christine?
Her video disappeared.
Yeah. Louise, do you want to go ahead, and hopefully Christine will be able to rejoin?
Yeah, because Christine was with us. Yes, so I'm Louise Chawla, and I was in the late 1970s. I entered a master's program in education and child development at Bryn Mawr College. And about 2 months into it, I realized what I really wanted to study was what children and teens learn outside of school, just by what the resources in their community and by getting out and about and experiencing the world outside school. And so I've been doing that ever since. I went on from there and did a doctorate in environmental psychology, which is a focus on people's relationship with the physical world. And I focused all my career on creating optimal community environments for child and youth development. And that means not just that we think we know what they need and we do it for them, but engaging young people in participatory visioning and design and planning. So a lot of my work has been that, doing participatory research and design and planning with young people to create better communities. And inevitably nature comes up. We don't need to worry about putting it in there. It always comes up. And as long as it's safe, they want it.
Super. Thank you very much, Louise. And it looks like Christine is cut out. Hopefully she can log in. So I think we'll plunge into some of the conversations about the key questions that the panelists wanted to address in a series of phone calls that we had prior to this session. And Nadav, I think this is a great follow-up to the keynote this morning from Dr. Fitzpatrick. And so I wonder if you could talk some about your experiences related to how equity and opportunities to enjoy the benefits of nature contact is a challenge in the United States because of the geographic distribution of under-resourced populations and this history of exclusion, segregation, and racism. So I think your efforts in offering nature
David, you got muted.
Yes, sorry, I don't know why I was muted. In any case, Nadav, so I'm hoping, when did I cut out?
Just for a couple seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so if you could talk a little more about Gateway to the Outdoors and your experience with this equity issue and your thoughts about what we can do, what the state of the evidence is about addressing under-resourced populations, especially in urban areas, that would be fascinating and invaluable. So take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for that question. I think Dr. Fitzpatrick really touched on it really well this morning, and she really brought a lot of good, well, not good, but a lot of strong evidence for the racism in the outdoors. And I think this is such a huge problem that we see both in, since I kind of have a research hat and a practitioner hat, and I see it both in the research and practice. For students at GGO, there are unfortunately so many racial, socioeconomic, and geographic barriers to nature contact that I'll start with an example of one time that I was on a overnight camping trip with GGO students. We were on a hike in Southern Illinois, And it was a group of probably 30 students. The majority of them were Black, and we were hiking in Southern Illinois. We passed by a group of 3 white high school boys, and I quickly had to move my students away from them because I saw the high schoolers pointing and laughing at the fact that there were Black people hiking. And I mean, this is like unacceptable, obviously, but sadly, this is the reality that we are living in the United States. And with recent events, I'm not sure if everyone remembers, this made huge media attention, the Christian Cooper case where a Black man in Central Park was just trying to bird, and unfortunately, a woman threatened to call the police on him when he was being extremely peaceful. So this is a really huge societal issue that we have here in the US. And this really hits home because growing up, I always was told as a child, nature doesn't judge you and that you can be yourself in nature. But what does that matter if you're being judged while you're in nature, if nature's not judging you? So there are amazing organizations and social media activists such as Outdoor Afro or the Instagram Brown People Camping, which are trying to break down these stereotypes of who belong in nature. However, this is a really huge issue, as Dr. Fitzpatrick talked about, and we really need to look at the issue of nature access. There are so many barriers and disparity in access to nature. There are many studies showing that low income or non-white, as well as urban communities, have significantly less access to nature contact or green space than their higher income white or non-urban counterparts. Additionally, a lot of the times, there's one study that found that in the US, the green space available to marginalized communities often have a higher crime rate than that city's crime rates average. So that's a huge issue. If you want to get people out in nature, it needs to be a safe place. It shouldn't be more dangerous than where they are walking in their city. Something that I haven't seen as much though in the literature is other smaller barriers that a lot of communities face, and Dr. Fitzpatrick brought up. I can speak from working with GGO where a lot of families do not want to have their kids sleep in tents. This is because sleeping in tents is associated with homelessness. And unfortunately, a lot of the students that Gateway to the Great Outdoors serves have been homeless or unstable home conditions within their lifetime. So for GGO, for example, what we do with our programming is for the first year that a student is in Gateway to the Great Outdoors, we exclusively camp in cabins. We do not have tent camping, just so that the student gets used to it and takes steps before they feel comfortable sleeping in tents. And we never force our students to sleep in tents. That's only if they want to. There are so many barriers, though, that I'm not even touching in this speech for promoting equitable access to nature contact and therefore promoting childhood mental health. And I think that's something really important that we need to address.
Thank you, Nadav. Luis and Christine, would you like to weigh in on this equity challenge?
Well, yes, I can just say from my work that, well, first of all, we know there are barriers to nature for all kids. When I started in this field in the late 70s and working through the 80s, there was a lot of research being done on kids free range, like how far were they allowed to go? And of course, kids push it and they go places their parents never know about. And but how far could they just roam around in their neighborhood, making their own discoveries? And what research shows now is that kind of regardless of who the kids are in terms of family income, ethnicity, lives have retreated indoors. And we know that about adult lives too. People have retreated indoors to a large amount, and they spend more time on screens, more time inside, more time in programmed activities if they're upper middle class, and less that freedom. I think that's a barrier. Just getting outside is a barrier for all kids. But then there are all those additional barriers that Nadav was talking about.
Thank you, Louise. Christine, did you have a comment or?
You're muted.
In the interim.
Am I muted again?
No, now we can hear you.
Okay, I've experienced every Zoom presenter's worst nightmare. My computer is blown up and now I forgot to take off the mute. But I would say when you're, as a researcher, when you're studying any type of disparity and disparity of access, studying this is particularly challenging because these challenges, they're often intertwined into much larger organizational, social, and cultural problems. And so the complexity of these issues, it requires that we include the voices of these stakeholders and the affected communities when we are conducting a research study or when we are planning policies. So I think it's important to keep these perspectives into account when in all of our work.
Yeah, so a question I had for the panelists is, I think Dr. Fitzpatrick remarks emphasized, African-American communities and notably in the Washington, D.C. area, but it occurs to me that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the under-resourced and people of color in the United States, and certainly here in Montgomery County, adjacent to Washington, D.C., the Latinx population are heavy users of the park, partly for soccer and sport, but also for what appears to be, without any focus groups, enjoyment of nature, families picnicking, and with the pandemic, many more families walking here in Rock Creek. So I wonder if you could if each of you could talk a little about sort of how well we've done in addressing, the diverse and multiple populations and thinking about heterogeneity in different communities in their experience of nature. And if we can learn maybe from some of the Latin communities, how it is that you can, enjoy the benefits of nature without necessarily linking it to, a history of labor or slavery or the other historical elements that influence some populations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I can just jump in because working with others, I created a group here, which is now in its 11th year, called Growing Up Boulder. And the three main partners are the school district, our university and our design program, and then the city, and multiple city agencies are active in it. So we really, exactly what Christine was talking about, find we really need to engage with all the different communities in the city. We have a lot of, a large Latinx, well, 13%, Latinx population in the city, but Asian, Middle Eastern, others too. And I think it's exactly what Christine was saying, to know what they want in parks, what's going to make them really comfortable and attractive to them. You have to sit down and talk with them. And we use, we talk with children and teens, but they can go out and interview their parents and their grandparents and kind of bring their adult voices in as well.
Yeah, just to echo what Louise said, something, since we are talking about children and youth on this panel, that I really, a research method that I really enjoy using, that me and Dr. Akinga have used together actually, is photo voice, where you have the students take pictures of their environment or how the environment affects their health. And then after they take the pictures, you sit down and have conversations with them about what that picture means to them and kind of how they interpret it. So you really get an understanding not only through hearing it in a pilot group, but you also get a visual understanding of the students' perceptions.
Right. If I could just add, based on our program and just years of work, we have a book called Placemaking with Children and Youth. If anyone's interested, I did with a couple colleagues, and it's got over almost 100 different methods and variations, including photo voice, for doing that kind of participatory research and planning. So anyone who wants to follow up on Nadav's suggestion, there's step-by-step how you do photo voice or lots of other things.
Great resource. Maybe you can paste a link to it in the chat box for the
Yeah, let me do that. Thank you.
Terrific. Christine, do you want to chime in on that, or shall we move on to your topic?
We can move on to my topic. I can touch on it.
Tremendous. So in our next segment here, Christine is going to talk a little about how you measure nature contact and some of the challenges in such measurement. We've been hearing how important nature is, how valuable it is, and I think we hear a lot of that in the shift context, but there are some profound research challenges, and so I'm looking forward to your thoughts about where we're at in terms of measuring contact and assessing the costs and benefits of experiences in nature.
Great. So I just want to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here today. And my name is Christine Akenga, and I'm an assistant professor of public health at Washington University in St. Louis. And I'm an environmental epidemiologist. So I'm really interested in the impact of environmental exposures on health outcomes. And as David mentioned, the notion that nature contact is good for people, it's very intuitive. Proof is another matter, however. We understand it's important, but there are some key elements in the research that we need to think about and address when we're measuring nature contact. And so I've divided this into like 3 questions. And my first question is like, what are the specific elements or attributes of nature that are required to achieve a health benefit? So what are the attributes? What type of interaction is required to achieve a health benefit? And my third question, and we've already touched on this, but do people of different races and ethnicities and cultures, they experience nature differently? And so to touch on my first question, like the specific elements and attributes required to achieve a health benefit, you know, in the literature looking at the mental health benefits of interacting with nature for children, there's a substantial diversity in the different elements of nature that are under consideration in the research. So we're all familiar with green space. There have also been studies that have looked at water, or what we call blue space, studies that have looked at elements of greenness or greenery, vegetation, such as grass and trees, gardens, parks, outdoor programs, such as Gateway to the Great Outdoors and educational programs, and a variety of just nature and outdoor settings like school yards and other settings. And I will say that there's evidence of health benefits with all of these different aspects, these elements of nature. But in the field and for research, we need agreement on how best to define nature contact and how to measure it. Which brings me to my second question, which is, what is the nature, that's a pun, of our interaction with nature, and how do we interact with it to achieve a health benefit? And I would propose that there are 3 broad categories in nature interaction. Accessibility, which is different from exposure, and which is different from engagement. And the first category, accessibility, I think is the ease of reaching destinations. And that's where most of the research has focused, in my opinion. And it's kind of thinking about the likelihood that a child will encounter nature, but that doesn't necessarily mean direct contact or interaction. And so in most of these studies, our measures are, you know, they're GIS based, they're geographically based, and we're just looking at proximity to one or more elements of nature. And this is different from the second category that I classify as like exposure, which is maybe you are in the condition of viewing nature or having contact or being subjected to some influence of nature. And for children, we're thinking about having a direct encounter with nature rather than just like a mere opportunity. And so we operationalize this in terms of time spent in nature or time spent near nature, or maybe just a use of a natural area such as a park. So that's the second category. And I think the third one, which I believe is one that we really should be thinking about in terms of the research, is engagement. And that's involvement in an activity. And it differs from the other two categories in that it implies an interaction that is more direct, more intentional, more sustained. And an example would be, you know, we've seen benefits and studies of children who've participated in outdoor like wilderness therapy programs for days or weeks. Like really active engagement is something we should think about when we're doing our research. So, you know, thinking about how we're exposed is important when we're thinking about the benefits. My third and final question, and we've touched on this, is do people of different races experience races, ethnicities, cultures, they experience nature differentially? And the literature says yes. And I think, you know, it's important to recognize that there are a set of complex and diverse issues that dictate nature experiences, particularly here in the US, and particularly for racial and ethnic minorities such as Blacks, Latinos, Indigenous, and other minority populations. And so it's much more than, you know, there's documented disparities in access, but there are other barriers that are, I would say, are less frequently investigated in our research. And I think there are research topics of discrimination, either real or perceived. Even before the events of this past summer with the pandemic and the George Floyd protests, many Black people, for example, felt excluded or unwelcome in parks and other natural spaces. So I had a couple of stories. I was reading about a family that had a terrible experience at a campground on the West Coast. According to these news reports, they were verbally assaulted with racial slurs, and they were harassed by a group of white campers that essentially did not like their presence there. Sometimes this type of discrimination, this type of racism, it doesn't have to be overt. So I encountered another story of a woman who went on a hike with her son, and she felt that she was being ignored by the other people in these spaces. She didn't necessarily interact with white people along these trails, but she felt what she called a sense of hypervisibility, is what she said. And she said, no one's saying anything, no one's being overtly negative or mean towards you, but just the way they're staring at you lets you know that there's something wrong. You don't belong here. Who are you and why are you here? And it's not like they're looking at strangers, other people that way. They're just looking at me and my son that way. And so I would propose that it's just not access. We also have to think about how welcoming some of our public natural spaces are.
Christine, on that note, can I interrupt you? We just have a couple more minutes in this segment, and I wanted to give the other panelists a chance to chime in and maybe share a little bit about their experiences with trying to better quantify exposure to nature in some of their studies and programs.
First of all, welcome all. And I just want to say that one of the issues we're discussing throughout the day today is how time in nature can relieve stress and anxiety. And nothing is more anxiety producing than not being able to get into a Zoom link. Anyway, thank you so much for your comments, Christine. I did want to say that colleagues and I have conducted a scoping review around the question, what is the minimum time dose in nature to positively impact the mental health of college-age students? And interestingly, we found that as little as 10 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week, can have measurable impacts on physiological measures as well as self-reported behavioral measures.
Super. Don, we're going to turn to your more extended remarks in a moment, but Luis or Nadav, did you want to make a point or two about how you've been measuring exposure in your work?
Yeah. Well, I want to say when Christine, and I think it was really important what Christine was saying about access, exposure, and engagement. And when you're talking about nature as a place for healthy development with children, engagement is so important. I mean, everybody knows, you watch children and they want to move. They want to be in there, you know, hands on, feet in, all their senses, full body. And that's something where we really get our insights in terms of how being in nature is beneficial from qualitative research, from observation. I think when you move to engagement, you really need to be watching what children are doing. With teens, I think they really don't want to be watched in general, but then they can be a lot more expressive in terms of, again, with qualitative research. And as Nadav said, taking photographs, writing, talking about their special places in nature and what they do there. And there are those quiet places of solace, but teens too, they want to challenge each other. They want to take risks. They, you know, they want to engage physically with the natural world.
Super. You know, let's move on. Dawn, I'm so glad you were able to join. Originally, Dawn was going to kick off this session of questions, and Luis was going to conclude. So I think we'll move to Dawn's segment. Dawn, I'm hoping you could, you know, introduce yourself a little bit, where you're from, a little bit about your history, and then address the state of the science on mental health benefits of nature contact for youth. So we've heard a little bit about some programming and exposure assessment, but we were going to ask you to spend 5 or 6 minutes kind of giving your assessment of where we're at in terms of understanding the magnitude of those benefits and programming aimed at delivering those benefits. So take it away, and I'll wave my hand at you when you're at about the 6 or 7 minute mark.
Right. Thanks so much, David. And again, it is wonderful to be with all of you virtually. In way of background, I had served for nearly 20 years as the executive director of Cornell Botanic Gardens at Cornell University. For the past 7 years, I have moved from that role back into a full-time faculty position. And I have 2 major areas of research and writing. One of them is the history and management and social outreach of botanic gardens, other types of public gardens, and have just, with 2 co-authors, had a book published called Public Gardens and Livable Cities. And then I work on the human benefits of time in nature. I've co-authored a book called Nature RX, Improving College Student Mental Health. And I conduct a number of research projects that look at how time in nature can be beneficial to all people. So with that as a bit of background, moving on to your question, David, I feel that we're actually in a period in which there is a robust amount of research being conducted on ways in which children, young people, teens are impacted by time in nature. As you reported, there was a recent article in the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics that found that somewhere around 16.5% of all children in the US, something like 7.7 million kids, are being diagnosed with depression, anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and that perhaps half of those young people are not receiving the benefits or the services that they need. Disturbingly, those kinds of problems in youth can follow young people into their college years. There was an assessment done last year by the National College Health Association that reported that 45% of respondents, 45% of college students indicated that they felt that they had a very high degree of stress in their previous 6 months. Similarly, another study that was done by the Association for University and College Counseling Center Directors found that the most common mental health problems in treated students were anxiety at 59%, depression at 48%, and stress at 47%. And it's important to point out that those studies were done before the COVID pandemic. So early exposure to nature and green spaces has repeatedly been shown to positively impact kids' mental health. One of my favorite studies was done by Christine Engemann and her colleagues in Denmark, in which they surveyed 900,000 young people across the country and found that children who grew up with the lowest level of green space were 55% in a higher risk of developing psychiatric disorders than those young people who grew up with the greatest level of green space. And similar results have been found in the US by Wells and Evans, and in the UK by Fliori, Maduhas, and Joshi. So the impact of green space on young people can also be felt by urban residents. There's a paper that's often been cited by Faber-Taylor, Kuo, and Sullivan that looked at a group of 7 to 12-year-olds living in a Chicago housing project. Individual apartments either had a view out into green spaces or only had a view of parking lots and concrete. Girls, although interestingly not boys, who had green views out their windows performed significantly better on tests of concentration, impulse inhibition, and delay of gratification. Having young people spend time out in nature can both prevent the advent of mental health problems later and reduce the symptoms of diagnosed problems. There was another study by Faber-Taylor and Kuo that focused on young people who have been diagnosed with ADHD. And what they found was that kids with ADHD who were taken for a walk through a nearby park were better able to concentrate on a variety of mental tasks than when those same kids went for an urban walk in a city or a walk through their own neighborhood. So time in nature can even impact conditions like ADHD. Over the past few years.
Don, let me interrupt you. If you could wrap up your remarks in the next minute, that will be good. We want to make sure Luis has a chance to share as well.
I will do so. So
now you're frozen.
With forest schools.
Don, I'm afraid you're breaking up, so hold that thought, and we'll get a chance to bring it up some more in the World Cafes, and in the finals, in the wrap-up section. We have about 9 more minutes. So Luis, I'd love to invite you to share a little about your research and thinking concerning the distress young people are experiencing now. I think Don alluded to some frightening and sad and difficult numbers about youth mental health. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about this distress people are experiencing specifically in relation to climate change and biodiversity loss, and how we can think about helping address that distress.
Thank you, David. Yes, so I was invited a couple years ago to be part of a team assessing measures of nature connection. So measures to determine how connected with nature people felt. Since my focus is working with children and teens, I took a group of us took the pile of measures designed for assessing nature connection with children and adolescents. And what I noticed going through them was that they all defined nature connection in positive terms. And we've been hearing all the good reasons for doing that. But so they're indicators of nature connection where enjoying nature, being curious about it, feeling comfortable and competent in nature, wanting to play there, and also recognizing the interdependence between people and nature, feeling oneness with nature and kinship with all living creatures, all these wonderful things. And that's real. But at the same time, for at least 10 years, I'd been following another strand of research, and I was struck these two fields of research are completely not communicating with each other. But there's another strand of research that has been, talking to young people, listening to them, and asking them what they envision the future is going to look like, and finding high levels of some really dystopic fears about what's going to happen, what is happening to the environment, and what the world is going to be like as they grow up. And I just want to read a few of these. I had a doctoral student, Susie Strife, who in her research, she included asking, these were 10 and 11-year-olds in Denver from different social classes, different neighborhoods, to draw what they think the earth will be like in 100 years, and talk about what are their hopes and fears for the future. And 72% of the children said things like this. So here's a girl. Everything will die out, and there will be less trees and less plants, and there will be less nature. It just won't be such a great earth anymore. Here's a girl who said something a lot of kids say. I feel sad because the animals are going to die. And I feel a lot of empathy with the animals, and so really concerned about biodiversity loss. And here's a boy. I feel sad because when I die, I'm probably going to have a grandson or great-grandson by then. And maybe them or their son is going to have to experience the end of the world. And those are really heavy feelings to carry around as a young person. So one of the people doing this research was a woman named Maria Ojala in Sweden. And she realized that we can look at these feelings young people have, their environmental fears and worries, through the framework of the stress and coping theory of Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman, which is widely used in the mental health field. And it says, you can categorize the different ways that people respond to stress. And this really worked. She created a scale for measuring young people's fears and worries about the environment and their responses that can be used with children aged 11 through adolescence. And she found that they did fall into these categories. Some deny that there are any environmental problems out there. They just dismiss them as unimportant to them. It's never gonna, happen to us or our friends and family. Some distract themselves. If the environmental news comes on the TV, they turn off the TV and go do something else. So this is emotion-focused coping of calming yourself down. And yes, we all need to calm ourselves down sometimes. But then you're not taking any action. You're not feeling empowered to do something. She found another category of kids who are really worried about the environment and what's happening. And they were trying to do things like bicycle to school or, recycle, conserve energy. And their levels of worry were so high, it was actually impacting their measures of their mental health. And she found this group felt alone with it. They were doing what they thought they could do, but they felt alone with the problem. And there's that recognition when it's a really big problem that what you're doing is futile. I mean, we can't solve problems like this alone. The young people who were doing the best, she found, were those that used what Susan Folkman calls meaning-focused coping. That means they recognized the problem, but they appraised it to find meaning in addressing it. And that gave them a sense of agency. And they also did not feel they were alone. They felt other people recognize the problem too. Because it's so serious, more and more people are getting engaged in trying to solve it. So when I'm doing my piece, I'm just part of a lot of other people doing their piece. And together we can make a difference. And so what's really critical there is that social trust, that knowing what other people are doing too, knowing you're not alone with. Another critical piece was people giving them safe spaces to talk about their environmental worries. And that if they didn't have this, they would tend to fall into despair or dismiss it. But when they could talk about it and people listened to them sympathetically, they were more likely to move into that meaning-focused coping category.
Louise, Dr. Chawla, thanks. That was a tremendously moving set of stories and experiences and research knowledge. I want people to hold their questions for the World Cafe and for the summing up section. We just have about a minute more before we have a short break and then move into the World Cafes with our panelists. My take on this session has been, we've covered these two poles, this pole of what a profound problem mental health is in youth in America today and presumably worldwide, and this kind of promise of nature contact as part of the solution to some of those problems. And what I'm hoping in the cafes and in the remainder of this session, we can start to think about what kind of research do we need to do to fulfill that promise of nature contact, to advance it as a common part of our strategies for addressing mental health in young people and indeed over the whole life course. So we're going to have a 10-minute break now and we'll regroup on the hour in the World Cafes, which I understand people are signed up for. I'm also delighted to welcome Ashby Sachs, a PhD student at the University of Colorado Boulder, who will be one of the World Cafe moderators, and Dr. Sharon Tesnier, a researcher on leisure health and resilience, who will also serve as a moderator. So I'm looking forward to the cafes and hearing from the participants in the conference, and then rejoining everyone for further questions and conversation. Okay, we have 70 participants, 105 and 22 seconds, so sock it to us, Luis.
Okay. I think one of the things that was kind of wonderful about our two breakout groups is that people talked about our question, which was, do any of you have examples of how you yourself or other people offer support to young people to help them cope constructively with their distress when they see or hear about the environment changing for the worse? We had examples that ranged from, kind of at every level, from the family, and from ways to engage the family. And as I think it was Laura, someone pointed out, many parents themselves are Terry Horton, are already disconnected from nature. And so creating opportunities like community gardens or community or family camping to bring the family together, where they can develop a shared feeling of comfort, and develop that competence being out, whether it's in the garden or it's camping or wherever it is. Family level, and working with the people who work with children. So Heather Benson gave a great example of working with the staff who work with special education children and kind of finding out what is their passion in nature. And it could be very different, or some of them love hiking, some of them love gardening, whatever it is. And then encouraging them to see how they can use that as a way of bringing children into experiencing nature, and again feeling this sense of agency that they can do positive things in nature. That was so important. And then we had people running programs like Matt Freer, and gave an example of creating that pathway from after school programs into paid internships for teenagers, into seeing career tracks and models of people who look like them who are doing different kinds of green careers. And Daniel Silva's in San Antonio talked, and others talked about Robbie Martinez talked about the importance of, and other people in our group, the importance of mentoring, and intergenerational mentors, so that every culture has its way of connecting with nature. And it's often the older people who know what that is. Okay. Thank you, Teresa. And they know what that is, and they can introduce it to the younger generations in their community. And finally, Laura Denks gave the example of a youth environmental film festival. Everything from, I think you said really 5-year-olds to college students who had opportunities to submit, share, kind of select for screening environmental films that they made. And what a wonderful way for them to communicate with each other about things they can do.
Thank you, Louise. That sounds like they were great sessions. Don?
So we also had really lively, rich discussions around the question of how can we get kids off of their video screens and outside into nature, and what approaches have worked. So Molly Shavitz talked about her work with early childhood centers and working with the instructors there to create an atmosphere of it's totally normal and expected for kids to be outside in nature, rather than looking at it as something that is exceptional or weird. And how wonderful to start in early childhood, pre-kindergarten, so that those habits really develop early. I'm sorry, Molly, that was not you. I apologize for that. Also, April Boyle, who's both a shark researcher and surf instructor, what a combination, had a wonderful saying, which is, find the shiny thing in your own organization that will appeal to young people. So her contention, which I certainly agree with, is that every organization has things that will turn kids on and get them connected with nature. Another important point that Bobby Lambert made was the importance of long-term engagement. Bobby's with Gateway to the Great Outdoors, and we talked about the fact that often one-off experiences for kids who have not had a background in nature and the outdoors can actually have very little impact, but that when you work with children repeatedly, you gain a sense of trust and they gain a sense of familiarity with the natural world. I think that's a very important point. Also, and I'm going to see if I can get the person who shared this correct. And I'm not sure who made this point, but it was Erika Virapongse talked about the importance of the language that you use with kids around nature, to not use judging words, to not use words that express your own fears, but rather support young people as they explore nature. So rather than saying, oh my God, don't go up so high in that tree, say something like, are you comfortable at that level? Do you want to try to go higher? So I thought that was great. And also a number of our speakers talked about the importance of engaging the whole community, that so many of us are disoriented from nature or uncomfortable with it. So it's not a matter of just working with the young people, it's really working with the family, with the community to change those paradigms.
Tremendous, Don. I want to have been in all these sessions. Ashby?
Great, thanks. I think I had some similar participants that Don had, but we also had a really great discussion. And I know sometimes Zoom can feel claustrophobic, but it went really well. I think the first group, a theme that came up, we had Bobby talked a bit about GGO as well. And one thing that really came up in our group was talking about letting kids have choice in how they're experiencing the outdoors and letting them find their own way and develop their own relationship without telling them or instructing them on how to be or act. And Erika brought that up with her family and how she is interested in, as far as nature education, something that interests her is incorporating the family into how kids are experiencing the outdoors, and not just the child, but also bringing the family along with, whether it's through a picnic or other educational activities, to really allow them to really tap into their cultural history and understanding there. And so as far as key takeaways of ways that we can bring choice into outdoor education, another participant talked about giving the youth 3 to 4 activities when we take them outdoors, and then they can really choose which direction to go, whether it's using vocabulary with a word exercise or digging in the dirt, etc., so that once they can really feel like they can express themselves outdoors, and that can sort of get the buy-in for them to come together for like a group activity, which I thought was really creative and interesting. And so my second group, we sort of went in a slightly different direction, but had a lot of different inputs on how we incorporate creative programming to engage youth. But one thing that came up, Dakota talked about building on Indigenous knowledge in her work in New Mexico. She was saying that what she took away from the panel discussion was really an understanding that not everyone has such a deep connection to the natural world that in her tribal experience they had from the very beginning. So trying to understand that in her work, building on using the medicine wheel, as far as the medicine wheel is broken into 4 different categories of social, mental, physical, and spiritual, as the way that they imagine all of the programs that they do in their work. But the challenge that she ran into was really like different granting organizations. She saw them as taking and not giving back. So really trying to refocus on maybe instead of having the tribal organizations adapt to the grants, having the granting organizations sort of adapt to cultural practices in these different tribes. So I thought that was really interesting and important. And we all agreed we have a lot, different cultures have a lot to learn from Indigenous cultural practices and how we experience the outdoors, and how to do that with respect to different tribes as far as data sovereignty. And actually we learned that from Dakota that different tribes actually have their own IRBs. So being respectful and also trying to learn more was something we're all interested in. So that's kind of what we took away.
Tremendous. Nadav?
Yeah, I want to echo David's point of I really wish I could be in all of these breakout rooms because everything sounds really interesting. But first of all, I want to thank everyone that was in my breakout rooms. We had such great discussion. We were discussing barriers that everyone's own community has with getting youth outside, and then potential solutions to that barriers. And it was really interesting to see because so many different communities had different barriers in access to nature, but then there were a lot of similar overlaps at the same time. Things included like access to local parks and utilization of local transit, additional safety concerns. And then there were also not only crime safety, but then also with heat and sunscreen and sun protection, which is definitely an increasing issue as climate change comes, and there will be even more issues with access to shade and such. So those were all really interesting points. And then we also ranged to talking about providing snacks and healthy foods during that and the barriers associated with that. And then additional things were intergenerational barriers where children might be scared of wild animals due to what they've learned growing up. And similarly, with horror films, a lot of students watch horror films, and I know on a lot of my camping trips, students always bring up Jason from Friday the 13th. So that's definitely a barrier. While it is a little silly, if your only exposure to nature is from horror films, you're going to be uncomfortable getting outside and going in nature. And then we also talked about the barriers of technology and how technology is really a double-edged sword, because there's a lot of research out there on how technology is bad for youth mental health, and how that might negatively affect youth mental health. But it's also a really good tool to getting kids outside because they are so engaged with their smartphones. So it is a really good toolkit to use, but you also have to be very careful. And additionally, someone brought up how the use of guidebooks is really an engaging things for students now, because they rely so much on using their technology today that using a guidebook is something foreign more so to them. So that was a really interesting point. So thank you everyone for who was in my discussion.
Thank you, Nadav. Christine?
Oh, great. Again, I want to thank the participants of the 2 breakouts for a really lively discussion. Our question was, what is the biggest challenge or barrier faced by your community that could be addressed by stronger evidence? And what are some of the potential ways to develop this evidence? And some of the challenges and barriers are, the evidence of perceived versus real access. So, just because you build it doesn't mean they will come. And this is particularly the case with certain communities low-income communities, single women with children. We identified older populations and minoritized communities of having barriers to access. We were also thinking about we needed more evidence on access versus engagement. And we thought about green gentrification and making sure that you know, if we're building these areas, that they're accessible for all, and that while also encouraging engagement for all. So again, just the idea of you build it, will they come? We wanted some more evidence on how we can meet communities where they are. And for some of these communities I mentioned before, you know, we're going to need a little bit more funding to reach out to these communities. And so some of the ways that we can make arguments to these funders. We thought that we needed more mechanistic work. So how exactly does nature benefit the mental health of children? And so some ways to measure this other than surveys. We talked about biomarkers. We talked about looking at health outcomes, but then there were some limitations with HIPAA. As we've heard recently. And then thinking about COVID and how COVID is essentially a natural experiment, and thinking about what we can learn from COVID in terms of introducing more access to nature, and also what happens when you take away exposure to nature. We thought that there should be more of a focus on prevention. And a lot of this work is done by nonprofits, but how do we educate our policymakers to incorporate public health and public officials and get their support for improving access and engagement? And then finally, quantifying the impact. How can we quantify the benefits of nature contact, both economically and socially? Like, what are some social benefits? And so I hope I've been able to cover what was some really lively discussions. And again, just thank the participants of my breakout rooms for a really interesting and strong discussion.
Thank you, Christine. Sharon, Dr. Tessner.
Thank you, David. Yeah, in both breakout rooms, try to sum up the connections here between the different comments and interventions people mentioned. The question we were starting from is what did the rest of the panel miss? What are some successful interventions that you have that would really benefit the conversation, and what can we add to that? So looking at, especially in this very digital time right now, how we can connect people to their nearby nature. So using those avenues as a gateway to connect people to nature, to see things differently, and using that to push them towards more self-awareness and nature as a whole, so that they're more aware of the conservation, more involved. So it's something that we can do virtually through remote therapy practices, just that self-guided quarter mile looking out your window. And whether they're guided or unguided, even if people are hesitant, they might come along on some of these shorter trips, or they might go because they're going with a child or a friend. So there's also a lot of power in seeing the people that are in this community and the international voices. I'm sure the Indigenous voices too, of how the forest time is important. The power behind the other people's voices, people other than ourselves, just adding to that conversation, because we're all looking for the same thing in nature. A little bit asking about biophilia and biophobia. So how are parents passing a fear of nature onto their children? Where are they? And what can we do to address that? We talked a little bit about some work I'm doing and using the researcher interaction with participants as the intervention itself. So as you're chatting with them and inviting them to the study, you're telling them about the benefits of their self-guided nature walk. And as they get to see the results of the surveys and some physiological data, they get to see that nature had an impact on them during their self-guided experience. And then they can take that back and tell their physician that this nature walk they went on is helping improve their health. So we know physicians really want their patients to have forest time because they know the benefit, but we're putting some of that power to advocate for it in the patient's hands too, as well as the physicians. We heard a bit about some interventions in Colorado where the lottery money can go towards funding open spaces and school playgrounds. So they have funded community-based coalitions where the youth have a strong say in what the program looks like. So the youth are really excited to go out and engage with that, and then they bring that home and educate their parents a bit, passing that along. So it's difficult in areas where you aren't able to see the return on investment. It's really difficult to sell people on the idea. So some different ways to keep educating people on the benefits of nature and what it has for it. Some of that we can get out of cell phones and the analytics. It's so easy to get that out there and get the information. Combining the personal perspective with the physicians and looking at how people's perspectives matter. Some of it to me is also about how the outcome of a nature intervention is about what outcome you're looking for. So it's not just that there isn't an outcome in certain types of nature, but that there's always an outcome. It just might not be the one we were trying to measure. So let's identify what that outcome might have been and how the different outcomes relate to different activities, even if those are around more built environments. So adults have a huge opportunity to model being in nature and the new ideas from nature. So I heard about a program that gives children 3 minutes on a walk to explore their senses. So instead of being told you have to be quiet for 3 minutes, they have 3 minutes that they can focus on whatever they want. So it gives them some freedom in that moment, but they can explore their senses and feel it. And we still need to be able to kind of isolate the experience, look at the small incremental changes that lead to behavioral change, and keep adults in the community that can model those changes, that mental awareness of the importance of nature, to keep passing that on to the next generation.
Sharon, fantastic, thank you. I know that there was a lot more even in the breakout group, so hopefully some of that will come up in the questions that people have for the panelists and for our moderators as well. Since so I just will take one minute to talk about the World Cafes I was in. I'm sorry, I'm not going to shout out to all the individual fascinating things that the cafe attendees said, but we focused on this question implicitly and explicitly about what kinds of evidence people use to change their programs, policies, and personal behavior. And I think I got a strong impression from both cafes that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the kind of evidence that is salient. And that seems really important to remember, since each of us can become focused on the evidence that matters in our own communities. And another point that really jumped out at me was the conversation people were having about how it's through engagement with each other, with their families, with their communities, and with nature that their practices and attitudes change. And that's very different from the kinds of evidence that I'm indoctrinated to absorb, which tends to be systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which clearly are unlikely to change many communities across the United States, with the exception maybe of the NIH community. So one of the things that made me think of, and I'm posting it in the chat box right now, is a guide to communication and collaboration written to help connect transportation and health research and practice communities. And I wondered if there was such a guide or such a project in this nature and health area, thinking about delineating the different kinds of communities that are involved in this and how to enhance their capacity to communicate with each other, to collaborate with each other, and to combine to create stronger evidence to advance the theme of nature contact as a tool for improving mental and physical health. So I commend that project to you in the link, and perhaps something for the Shift group to talk about if this doesn't already exist as a potential project. So what I want to do now is open up the the lines for questions for the panelists, and you know, for a conversation amongst the panelists as well as the part of our final half an hour. And so please drop questions into the chat, and I'll kick it off with a question from Christian, who writes, how do we bring 10,000 years of anecdotal evidence, and that is to indigenous knowledge, into our Western evidence base? And that's a great question, because that came up in our World Cafe, where Dakota Jim, who was a good participant in the cafe she attended, pointed out that funders are often asking her for evidence to support projects promoting nature contact and health in the indigenous communities. But for her and her communities, it's the community practice that is the meat and potatoes of the evidence when something is good. And so there's this mismatch between some different ways of knowing and deciding. So I'd love to hear the panelists' perspective on that question.
You know, I'll jump in here, David, and mention that with a colleague at the University of Connecticut, Laura Brown, we have developed a resource that we call a guide to anti-racism in the outdoors. And I'll post that in the chat. And it's comprised of capsules and web addresses of many organizations, articles from the popular press and scientific press, and blog posts, etc. And I feel that we've covered many or most of our ethnic and racial groups in that guide. Where we've really fallen off is with indigenous people, with Native people, and really open up the forum. We would love to have suggestions from participants about resources that specifically address issues with indigenous people and access to nature. People may operate on the assumption that because the natural world is so inherent to indigenous peoples, that this should not be an issue. But I think that with so many Native people now living in more urbanized environments, it is very much an issue.
Thank you, Don. A second question. Well, do any of the other panelists want to chime in on that one? Going, gone. Okay, another question in the chat box. How are we defining time outdoors in nature? Can this include children playing outside in their front yard, backyard, or even in the street, as long as they are getting outside? So Christine, I'd love you to comment on this, because this is precisely the challenge of exposure assessment. What do these different behaviors, settings, and contexts mean in terms of nature? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these different settings.
My thoughts, there's more work to be done. I mean, there's evidence that you don't even necessarily have to have direct contact. Just viewing a video, for example, confers benefits. So I think that, you know, this is a fantastic question, and there's just much more work that needs to be done in terms of like the type of nature contact and the different settings, and, you know, the duration. What we're trying to work towards is a recommendation, right? A recommendation for policy. And so some of this mechanistic work needs to be done so that we can recommend, how do you say, like a dose, a specific dose. And so I think it's an excellent question, and there's just more work that needs to be done.
Super. This is maybe a question for Sharon and for Luis. could you say some more about, we're in a catastrophe, some short-term catastrophes, the pandemic and the economic upheavals, and there seem to be a lot of hurricanes and things. And so these are going to lead to trauma, I think. And so what do we know about, what evidence is there that nature experiences can really ameliorate that? Is this a established body of fact based on randomized controlled trials, or are we still in the middle of figuring out if nature contact is a key therapy for trauma associated with disasters?
Sharon, do you want to start for that? I can jump in too, or do you want me to begin?
I think in the wealth of my knowledge on this, we know a lot, and a lot of what we know, the deeper information, I think, is stuff that we need to borrow from other fields. People design tools and interventions to treat illnesses that are based on the way something works in the natural world. So if we borrow from that, we know a lot, and there are a lot of really good and useful things that nature does. But most of the knowledge at this point is still based on the fact that we have been living in nature for a very long time. Humans evolved living in nature, and now we try to shove ourselves in these little teeny boxes. And I like to see not nature as an intervention, but the built environment as a potential health disparity, right? So you can only tolerate so much of that without having problems. And the data on that is maybe a little lacking, but the historical context of the fact that humans need nature goes back forever.
Yeah.
Louise?
Well, I mean, there's a whole field of research, and I'm not an expert in it, but disaster recovery, which I think is especially relevant to climate change, to kids who, have lived through flood and fire and loss of their homes, displacement. And I know there has been some research with those communities, Gulf oil, young people along the Gulf oil spill or the Alaska oil spill, for example. And, creating places where they can get together and again have opportunities to share their experiences and come up with their ideas to what they can do to help their communities recover are very important. But David, in terms of your question, how much evidence do we have here? How firm is it? I think it's like a lot of clinical evidence where it's case study evidence. And I don't know if that's enough for you there in the NIH, but it's certainly out there in terms of case study evidence.
Super. A fantastic question, and I'm hoping all the panelists can weigh in on this one. Comes from Teresa Horton. What is the optimal environment for humans? So we've been talking about nature and about going outside in the backyard or playing in the street or going to a wilderness area. What does that a good environment or the best environment look like? Ashby, why don't you start, since you worked hard in your World Cafe, and if you can answer this question, I'm sure you'll get your PhD.
Okay, great. How many follow up with you in 2 years? But I think something that came up today that I think about a lot is changing the way we understand nature contact. I think everyone here probably thinks about that too, but rather than something far away, but something that's right here and right at home, because people are more and more living in cities, and cities are getting hotter and hotter. So especially here in Denver where I live. So I think the optimal environment for humans is something where nature is nearby and where it allows us to feel comfortable and connected. So I think there's so much research out there that shows that tree canopy can improve health and well-being in so many different ways. So I think the more that we can focus on how we can increase and expand opportunities to access nature closer to home is really going to be more realistic in creating more livable lives for people.
Super. You know, Nadav, you just moved to New York City. Do you want to comment on this question? And to what extent, you know, the Upper West Side is going to be an optimal environment for humans?
Well, I definitely don't know exactly the correct answer. And I think this is definitely an answer that people struggle with a lot, what the optimal environment for people is. That question that I think is not to insult Terry at all, because she's very smart. And but there's something about the question of what is best for humans, and I think we need to think about it a little bit more holistically of what's best for the planet, both humans' interaction with the environment as well. And I've been thinking about this not academically at all, just as I've been wandering my own brain about how kind of how we need to have some sort of more local interaction with our environments and a better connection with how we like our food and stuff like that. So I'm not exactly sure the best answer to that, but I think something a little bit more of a local model where we on a daily basis are forced to interact with nature, whether it's getting tomatoes from our garden or going on a walk to go to work. So just a little bit more of a local focus than our very global world we live in.
Good point.
David, if I could build on those very good comments from Ashby and Nadav, many of us are familiar with that classic essay from William Cronin, The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature. And basically the point that Cronin wisely makes there is that we tend to idealize nature. We almost tend to see nature as a dichotomy. You're either in nature or out of nature. And I think that in order to really make some significant paradigm shifts in this country, people have to see that they need to protect and celebrate all the nature that is around them, not simply the Grand Canyon, as wonderful as it is.
Can I go really big picture on this? We talk about the ideal environment, but some of it is place attachment and what we like. Some of it is biophilia versus biophobia. But if you take a step back and look at the ideal environment as being one that meets our physical, psychological, our social needs. And if our current environment isn't meeting those, we have these health problems and we look to nature to meet it. And to me, that's a sign that our environment isn't ideal. You know, we have to find that fix. But what that balance is going to be different for everyone based on their history, their upbringing with nature, and that balance of place attachment.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you, Sharon, that there's no one size fits all optimal environment for everybody. And we do have to think about culture and all of this diversity of ways of relating to nature that we've been hearing about all through this morning. I want to pick up, you know, Nadav, you were saying the optimal environment for nature. For humans, we have to think of that in the context of the question of what is the optimal environment for the whole natural world. And I think that takes us back to Christian's opening comment that, you know, yes, nature can be a wonderful medicine, but we need to think beyond what can we take from it to what can we give to it. And that shifts us to this whole discussion I see friends share with me that's going on now with like the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Studies. How do we think about our relationship with nature, and saying we have to think in terms of these relational values and how doing things for nature that is good for nature are simultaneously good for us. And I think we've heard that, and I certainly heard some of that in our breakout group. And that opens up the door for Indigenous voices as well, who have this long tradition of living symbiotically in the natural world, of both taking and giving back, and have that very much part of their culture. And I think we do need to bring these relational values language into the way we think about optimal environments.
Christine, did you want to, you're the last one. What's the optimal environment for humans?
I think how can I follow my esteemed panelists? I think they've covered it. I think, it depends. But I really liked Sharon's comments about thinking about an environment that meets all of our needs, both physically, psychologically, and socially.
So super, good question. I'll be thinking about that. So another question that has come up is, we haven't talked much about working out the physiological and psychological mechanisms linking nature exposure and health outcomes. And I think that might be important. I just reviewed a grant proposal, and the grantee said, if we can work out the mechanisms linking physical activity and lung cancer risk, which is a known epidemiological association, we will be in a much better position to persuade clinicians to prescribe physical activity. So I think there's a parallel here. If we understood the kind of biology and neuropsychoendocrophysiology of how nature influences, our mental health, that is some of the kind of evidence that can lead to, Kaiser Permanente incorporating nature therapies in its healthcare delivery. So where are we at in terms of understanding those mechanisms? Christine?
Where are we at?
You're showing up on my screen still, since you were the last one to speak. So, epidemiology can help us with those mechanisms, but I think we're at the very early days of working out like the molecular genetics or the physiology of these exposure outcome relationships.
I think, in general exposure assessment, the gold standard is biomarkers. And if Teresa Horton is in the chat here, or would be willing to mute, she could share some of her experiences thinking about biomarkers and how they can be indicators of both exposure and indicators of health effects. But in terms of, that's the type of evidence I would be looking for in terms of providing support for the mechanistic benefits of nature, really looking for biomarkers.
Well, I am here. I would say we are at an early stage of it. And, David, I was wondering whether you were going to be reading the abstract for the grant that I've got in at NIH, but it's in a different institute than yours. But it's like, could you go over to the other institute and put it up for me? So, okay, I'm going to try to start my video. Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
It hadn't been working earlier. So doing biomarkers is hard. And one of the reasons they are not used much more frequently is they're much more expensive than doing survey work. And you have to be working with somebody who has a lab, and you need field-friendly methods. But the nice thing about being an anthropologist in the department that I'm in is we develop field-friendly methods. And so we're trying to get that information out to people on how to be able to do this, on an easier way. But in terms of actually being able to do it, there's really cool work coming out. Everything from brainwave scans to looking at heart rate variation, to looking at cytokines. And, cortisol is tricky. Unfortunately, cortisol is the first thing everybody wants to measure, but it's such a reactive hormone. It may not be the best thing to use to actually measure stress. But the work is coming, but I think, as Christine said, we're just at the beginning, and as David said, we're just beginning to build that. And part of it is we need to convince review panels that this is really an important question and worth funding.
Super, yeah. I noticed in one of the Slack channels a shout out and a squib to a professor's work, Strayer at the University of Utah, really measuring a variety of physiological responses to camping expeditions. And that work looked fascinating and a beginning of an effort to, you know, continue to delve into the mechanistic basis of outcomes associated with nature exposure. So I'm excited to see that in the coming years. And I do think, you know, that speaks to that kind of work is important for communicating to one of the target audiences, the kind of biomedical audience. But we also have to remember there's a lot of different audiences and make sure we don't swing too much in, you know, one direction versus another.
I want to just jump in very quickly.
Yeah, please.
From the perspective of a developmental psychologist, we're not just a mechanism. There's also the way of looking at us as human beings with basic functions that we need to be able to realize for a fully functioning and flourishing life. And that kind of brings us back again to there's a value in qualitative research as well. And you know, people being you know, again, seeing what works, kind of where people are flourishing and their own experiences of that in their words. I mean, one kind of easy to communicate quick view of that functional view of human beings is Ryan and Dacey's self-determination theory that says we all need autonomy, we all need to feel competence, we all need relatedness, and we can, you know, really see people having those experiences in nature and then look at, you know, what are the settings, what are the affordances of those places, both physical and social, that enable people to have these experiences of.
Fantastic point. Thank you, Louise.
If I can jump in there too, I've done a lot of work on the physiological stuff, and I think a lot more data exists than we're aware of. It's just so far outside of our field. And pretty every element of the body, there's some component that nature does a better job of health-wise. And that exists. You just have to pick and choose and dive a little further into it. We actually built, this is a PVC pipe. It's got my phone attached. I cut it with a string and put some crafting copper sensors. So you can hand this to a participant at the trailhead. The screen would tell you to sit and stand. And out of that, we're getting, the survey is connecting a couple different scales and what looks like a hospital intake form. So we have some of their health history as that relates. We're getting HRV, heart rate variability data, and out of that, we're able to pull vagal tone and ventral vagal recovery. So how quickly they recover from just the simple stressor of sitting and standing. So just going out and with a handful of devices and doing that on the trailhead, you get enough data from that. You can pick and choose self-directed experience, and between experience and health conditions, how that impacts people. The study was kind of cut short. I don't have funding for my time anymore. COVID changed the dynamics of that study, but it wouldn't be hard to implement anywhere if somebody has a place and some people to do it, to get that, such a rich data set that we can get out of that, and then start looking into that and get more data.
I love the idea of low-cost measurement tools being integrated into evaluation and citizen science and what have you. Maybe the Gateway to the Great Outdoors program could learn about the design of this sensor and incorporate it into some projects for some of their STEM learning and nature contact experiences. So hopefully Nadav will email you.
I definitely will.
So we're just about at the end of this session. So I want to just say a couple things as moderator. First of all, thank you to all the panelists and all the attendees for a really fascinating day. I'm trying to convince the panelists to work on a little meeting summary document, maybe even a paper, to try to capture some of the ideas, conversation, resources, and things that emerged from this. And I think, you know, we should all be thinking about this challenge of how better to harness research to understand, you know, nature, and how to work with nature to promote the planetary health and personal health. And I think we've already seen some trends in the US in positive directions. For example, the walkability movement aimed at improving urban environments through a combination of affordances for walking, but also parks and trees and what have you. We've seen the Forest Service and other agencies really try to focus on getting children out into the parks. And these kinds of policy changes arise from the efforts of research communities and advocates to sort of come together to build a case. It isn't always randomized controlled trials, but it's a body of knowledge and a movement, a community of people that attempt to make this argument. So it feels to me, and I'm new to Shift, that Shift is trying to be and successfully trying to be a nexus of that kind of change. So I certainly hope that a follow-up to this session is continued thinking about the different kinds of stories, evidence, quantitative and qualitative, that can be used to improve the use of nature and the experience of nature, especially in this case for mental health of youth. So it's been beautiful to see that, and I certainly hope to stay engaged in this, and I hope all of you continue to champion these efforts in that direction. I do note also that I saw in the chat that that Dr. Horton and others are working on a project aimed to consult a Delphi panel to figure out, you know, how different communities are using evidence and what they need to help motivate them. So that should fit in with what I see as some of the emergent themes of this last 3 or 4 hours. So do any of the panelists have a final word they want to say? And I yield my last 2 minutes. I'm looking at my pieces of paper to see if I'm supposed to do anything else at this point. But
David, I'll make a real quick comment, which is that I think that we tend to assume that when individuals, young people, are in nature, they're aware of being in nature. And being at a university campus, I can tell you how not true that is, because kids spend so much time oblivious to their surroundings. So a study I would love to do in the future, but haven't had a chance to yet, has to do with intentionality in nature.
Great point. Luis, last words?
Mute. It's critical for us to feel we have a really good audience out there that, you know, has a lot of experience themselves and is really engaged. And I want to thank our audience.
Okay, everyone, have a great afternoon, and I look forward to more parts of the Shift meeting in the next couple of days. So thank you all.
Thank you.